Hello again. Today I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you guys about our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, and you might respond by saying, why? Why spend time talking about a president that hardly anyone ever mentions outside of history classes? Well, there's method to my madness, believe it or not, and this little presentation will lead us to a couple of questions that I want to leave you with at the end, so bear with me. Calvin Coolidge, in many ways a very average, commonplace American. He was born on July the 4th, 1872 in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. And I ask you, can you get any more American than that, to be born on the 4th of July in a place with a name like Plymouth Notch, Vermont? As a young man, after graduating from college, he moved from Vermont to Massachusetts, settling in Northampton, Massachusetts. There he studied and practiced law. He got married. He became involved in Republican Party affairs, held a number of minor elective offices, and eventually in 1918 was elected governor of the state of Massachusetts. And it was while he was serving as governor that he got his first national notoriety when he took a very strong stand in opposition to striking members of the Boston Police Department. Many members of the Boston Police Department went on strike for higher wages, and Governor Coolidge responded by trying to break up that strike by calling out the Massachusetts National Guard. He also issued a statement in which he very strongly said that, in his opinion, no one had any right to strike against the public welfare at any time. And that stand he took against the striking members of the Boston Police Department made him something of a darling among anti-union Republicans, and he was rewarded with the Republican vice presidential nomination in 1920. The presidential nomination went to Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio, and the Republican ticket of Harding and Coolidge buried the Democrats in an avalanche in the election campaign of 1920. And after taking office as vice president, Calvin Coolidge did very little. Indeed, the Constitution doesn't give the vice president much to do except to preside over sessions of the Senate. But this situation changed abruptly in August of 1923. While vacationing on the West Coast, President Harding suddenly died either of a stroke or a heart attack. At that particular time, Vice President Coolidge was visiting his father's family in Vermont. His father was a justice of the peace, and in the wee hours on the morning of August the 2nd, 1923, the senior Mr. Coolidge administered the oath of office to his son, making him the 30th President of the United States. And after taking the oath of office, Calvin Coolidge simply went back to bed. Sleep was very important to Calvin Coolidge. He tended to sleep about 12 hours a night, took a 2-hour nap each day after lunch. Now, as I've said, he was a very average, commonplace fella in many regards. Certainly he was in terms of his physical appearance. One of the few things that Harding, his predecessor, had going for him was that Harding was a rather tall, distinguished-looking man. He tended to look presidential. Not so with Coolidge. He was a rather plain man who could easily blend into most any crowd. Also very average in terms of his personality. He tended to be a shy man who said very little either in public or private, and when he did say something, he usually used as few words as possible. Some of you may be familiar with the story that's often told of Coolidge attending a party in Washington, D.C. After he got there, he said absolutely nothing. The flustered hostess finally came over to him and said, "Mr. President, I've made a bet with my friend over there that I can get you to say at least 3 words." And Coolidge responded by simply saying to the lady, "You lose." And shortly after that, he left. So, pretty average fella in many regards. Was there anything unusual about him, outstanding about him? Well, he played the harmonica, if you want to consider that outstanding. I'm guessing he probably played campfire music. I can't imagine Calvin Coolidge getting down and playing the grungy blues or anything of that sort. Also, he had a rather wry sense of humor, and he loved to play practical jokes on people, getting great delight from the jokes that he was playing. For example, After moving into the White House, he had the maintenance staff install some buttons next to his bed in the living quarters. These were connected to buzzers down on the main floor of the White House, and one of his favorite little pranks was to get up there and press all the buttons at one time with buzzers going off on the main floor, making it appear that there was some crisis up above. So staff members would go scrambling to the living quarters, and lo and behold, they couldn't find Coolidge. He'd gone off and he was hiding someplace, getting great delight out of this, like some 12-year-old kid getting delight out of the consternation that he was causing his staff members. On another occasion, he had his staff invite some members of the Washington Press Corps over to the White House for an old-fashioned New England breakfast. And on the morning of the breakfast, the invited reporters were shown into the president's dining room. There sat the great man saying absolutely nothing. Eventually, waitstaff came in and began serving coffee around the table. And after coffee was served, the assembled reporters saw the president committing this apparent social faux pas, something that probably most of you have never seen before. But an older generation of Americans often would take a cup of coffee and pour a portion of the coffee out into a saucer to cool. And after it had cooled there a while, you could do a couple of things. You could either pour that coffee back into the cup to help cool the coffee that was there, or you could do like my grandfather used to do and simply drink the cooled coffee directly from the saucer. Either way, that's not something you're supposed to do in public, certainly not in the White House. But there was the president doing it. So around the table, an unspoken agreement was reached that if the president did this, they had to do the same thing. So around the table, trying not to spill any coffee on the White House linen, reporters began pouring out coffee into their saucers. And Coolidge simply sat there watching them, saying absolutely nothing. And then he waited for the last person to finish. And they were then waiting for their cue as to what to do next. Pour it back into the cup, drink from the saucer. What do you do? Well, Coolidge, with, I'm sure, a demonic look on his face, put his own saucer of coffee on the floor. He called over his pet collie to drink the coffee from the saucer, leaving these poor people to shift for themselves and decide for themselves what to do, whether to drink from the saucer or pour it back into the cup. So that was his wry sense of humor. You might even say a somewhat twisted sense of humor. So yeah, a few outstanding characteristics, I guess you could say, but on balance, in many ways, a very average fellow. Yet, for all that averageness in his day, Calvin Coolidge was a tremendously popular president. So why? Why was he so popular if he was so average? My answer is I think there were a couple of things that contributed to the popularity of Calvin Coolidge. First of all, I think he was a popular president in his day because for millions of Americans, I think John Calvin Coolidge, that was his full name, was a living symbol of the past. And it was comforting to have the man in the White House. This was a time of very rapid change in America. Millions of immigrants were flocking into the country. Women were demanding more rights and more opportunities. Young people were rejecting the moral standards of their parents. Millions of folks were uprooting themselves and moving from the countryside into America's growing cities. So it was a time of very rapid change, even turmoil in America. And during this time of rapid change, I think at a certain level it was comforting to a lot of folks to have this man, whose full name, as I said, was John Calvin Coolidge, sitting in the White House. He was basically an old-fashioned, rock-ribbed New England Puritan, and I think deep down a lot of folks felt that if the country could still produce presidents like this, we must still be basically all right as a country, despite all of the turmoil that was going on in the nation at that particular time. A second thing that I think accounted for the popularity of Calvin Coolidge was that he was, in reality, just the kind of president that millions of Americans wanted at that time. Keep in mind, we had recently passed through the Progressive Era. Then we had fought a land war in Europe for the first time in American history. That war was followed by an intense national debate over whether or not America should enter the League of Nations. And as a result of all of these occurrences, by the 1920s, I think many Americans were simply tired. They were tired of reforms and crusades. They were tired of reforming presidents like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. They didn't want another reformer in the White House. They wanted somebody who would simply leave them alone. And Calvin Coolidge, a man who believed that government and the president should interfere in the lives of people as little as possible, was exactly the kind of president that millions of Americans at that time wanted. So those were the two things, I think, that accounted for the popularity of Calvin Coolidge. And to amplify on this a bit, I would like to ask you to look at another YouTube video. This one is about 4 minutes in length, and it is a video of Calvin Coolidge standing on the White House lawn in 1924, delivering what is apparently the first filmed presidential address. So do a YouTube search for Calvin Coolidge, and you'll find that 4-minute snippet. And in that presentation, Calvin Coolidge hammers on two themes: low taxes and small government. And each time I watch that video myself, it occurs to me that that speech made by Calvin Coolidge back there in 1924, I think could easily be delivered by any Republican Party leader today. John Boehner, Paul Ryan, John McCain, I think all would basically be comfortable delivering this same speech, emphasizing low taxes and small government. So the first question I want to leave you with simply is this: is this an appropriate guideline for America in the 21st century? The Coolidge formula of low taxes and small government. The second question would be one concerning Coolidge himself. Do you think we need another president like Calvin Coolidge? Certainly there would be those folks who would answer in the affirmative. Ronald Reagan was a great admirer of Calvin Coolidge, and he had a portrait of Calvin Coolidge placed in the Oval Office during Reagan's presidency. And when I was doing some research for this presentation, I came across this quote that I would like to share with you, written by another present-day admirer of Calvin Coolidge. This was written in September of 2010, and I quote, "A man like Calvin Coolidge is what we need today as our president to return this nation to its roots, to God, and the Constitution." So that's my second question. Do we need another president like Calvin Coolidge? Archie Bunker used to say in every episode of All in the Family, we need another Herbert Hoover today. So I'm asking you, do we need another Calvin Coolidge in the White House? So that's it for today. I'll be back soon with another addendum to American history. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, study hard, and I'll be talking to you again soon. Bye for now.